Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Little. Hope you're having a fantastic day. Today, we're going to be discussing GTO tournament adjustments. Okay? So, what are some common spots in tournaments where you should deviate from standard GTO? I got this question just the other day after doing a live webinar with Michael Acevedo where he went through many of my hands, and there were some spots where we looked at the GTO strategy. I played my hand just like the GTO strategy said to do, but then he's like, you should probably do something different here. And the question is when and why, right? So we're gonna go through some common spots where you should probably deviate from the at least typical standard GTO play if you just ran the hand straight through the solver. Now, and also you can even say, like, if you node lock for your opponent and presume your opponent plays in a very specific way, right? So a big concern in a tournament is that you really don't want to risk your entire large stack without a substantial edge. So whenever you have something like 20 big blinds or more, you should really shy away from spots that unnecessarily risk your entire stack without a decent edge, right? And this is because if you do lose a big pot or all of your chips, you're going to lose all or much of your potential to play additional profitable spots in the future, right? So like say you're going to win at a higher win rate with a deeper stack, which is usually true if you're good. If you happen to get shallow, you're going to lose a lot of those future potential spots, right? So you don't really want to play in marginal scenarios where you don't have much of an edge, when in the future you will be able to play with an edge. Now, the problem with this and the issue with this is that a lot of people take this concept way too far. I mean, someone just this morning at a little coffee said, I have stuff like middle pair. I'll call a loose player's flop bet. I'll call their turn bet, but then I'll fold if they bet the river. And that's just a horrible strategy because, well, you already told me what you think they're doing wrong. You think they're playing too loosely and too aggressively. So you're basically playing right into their strategy. You're doing exactly the wrong thing because, if anything, you need to be calling the river way more often than normal, right? And they think, I'm just going to pass this spot or skip this spot and wait for a better spot. But the thing is like if you're just sitting there consistently folding out 10 or 12 big blinds of your stack over and over and over again, well, how in the world do you ever expect to win the tournament if you're just giving away 10 big blinds to the loose aggressive players playing exactly into their strategy, right? So let's take a look at some common spots. The most obvious is with the marginal made hand. This is a hand like directly from that webinar I did the other day. You should be less inclined to bet with marginal made hands in spots where the GTO strategy is to bet with your entire range. So in this hand, I think I had something like, 30 big blinds. I raised under the gun. And then the big blind called, good loose aggressive player. Flop comes queen 8-2. Actually, I think it was queen 7-2 in my exact hand because remember there was no straight draw. Super dry board, right? Like this is the most dry board. And I mean, like I would have bet really good money if you ran this through the solver. It would say you should be betting with like 98% of your range using mostly a small bet and every once in a while a big bet. Story checks out. Sounds about right. Michael ran it through the solver, and that's what it said. But he said with hands like 8-7 and hands like pocket jacks, then in those scenarios exactly, checking behind is probably really good because if I bet and get raised, this decently strong hand has all of a sudden become very marginal. And do I want to take my generally strong hand that can easily call a turn bet on any turn and can call a river bet from aggressive players on most rivers? Do I really want to take this and put it in a spot where every once in a while I get check raised? And the answer is probably just no. Mark says, seems like middle pair needs more protection than pocket jacks does. Do we check them at the same frequency? The solver like checking both of them at like 5% frequency or something. So I mean the answer is basically no, but you're going to find that those types of hands typically play roughly the same because the thing is like 8-7, yes, it needs more protection, but it improves to a nut hand more often when it gets a 8 or a 7. Whereas pocket jacks needs less protection, which is, good reason to check it, but it like almost never improves to a good hand. So they play pretty much the same. Basically, if you bet and get called, or if you bet and get raised, you're not really loving it in either scenario. Obviously, though, jacks can check it back more easily than a hand like 8-7. Anyway, the adjustment here was that you really don't want to play a big pot. So take the most obvious hands to check it behind and then just check them behind. Now, I remember someone saying in that webinar, like, what if your opponents use some logic and they figure out that the most obvious hands to check behind here with are exactly these types of hands, which are going to be middle pair type hands. Well, now if they know that your range is just really, really, really face up, right? Now they can actually play pretty well. And the answer to that is yes. The problem, though, is that if you announce you have something like middle pair and you don't really have much of a sample on your opponent, they're going to have no way of knowing if you plan on folding to additional aggression or if you plan on calling down against additional aggression. They really don't have any way of actually knowing that. So if they have no way of actually knowing that, then they're going to basically be acting either using the GTO strategy, which, is fine because you're just going to be calling down a lot, or they're going to be playing either too loose and too aggressive, in which case you're still going to call down at roughly GTO strategy, which is fine, or they're going to be not betting very often at all, which allows you to just very easily realize your equity. So either way, pretty much no matter what they do, it's okay, right? And so if all of the options are going to work out well enough in most scenarios, then what's the problem, right? Just do that. Make your life a million times easier, and then you're good to go. And that probably is just the answer in these scenarios. So marginal made hands, this is going to be stuff like a bad queen or 7 or the middle pairs here between pocket 8s and pocket jacks. Those hands probably just want to check. You probably want to bet stuff like 6s and lower, because if you bet 6s and lower and you get raised, you should probably just fold. If you, and also those hands really want protection, right? Whereas, 8-7 needs less protection than a hand like 6s. So, that is a reason to check, kind of like Mark alluded to just a second ago. So anyway, marginal made hands like to check. So this keeps pots manageable, right? It allows you to lose more of these pots with marginal made hands before you go broke. Like we said, you really, 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 really don't want to be going broke. And these marginal made hands are hands that could very easily get you in a lot of trouble. So checking makes it harder for you to go broke, which is great. However, and this is going to be a recurring theme, if your opponents will respond in a weak, passive manner, like always check calling with their top pairs, right? Against opponents like that who are literally never bluffing you or rarely bluffing you, and also aren't going to raise with their good but still vulnerable hands, then we should probably just be continuation betting our entire range, even in spots where you may naturally think we want to have a decently wide checking range, because we're going to always get to at least realize our equity. You're going to find that the one thing that your opponents can do that really screw you up is raise and not let you realize your equity. So if they're not going to raise and let you not realize your equity or make you not realize your equity, then you just get to continuation bet very, very frequently because you get to realize your equity, right? Like nothing can really go wrong. And if nothing can go wrong, then it's kind of free to bet. And this actual hand, I remember it was kind of a brutal one. I bet small on the flop, like I thought I was supposed to do my whole range. My opponent check raised me. I obviously called. Turn was, I think, an ace. He checked, and I bet small again, thinking that he should probably never be check raising me here because I just have a whole lot of ace queen type hands and like just ace X in general, like ace king, backdoor draw, ace jack, backdoor draw, etc. But then I bet small, as I thought I should do my whole range. Solver was mixed with the 8-7, so you can kind of go either way. And then he check raised me again. So I got double check raise from literally one of the best players in the world. And like that's the exact type of player you should be checking the flop with to just sidestep that whole disaster. So like in that spot, I ended up losing like 12 big blinds or something in a situation where the easy solution is to just check it back and then move on with your life with no problem. So very, very bad spot for me that was easily avoidable and probably learned my lesson. Something else you should be doing against the generally good at loose aggressive players is just generally avoid spots where you open yourself up to getting raised when you really don't want to get raised, right? So that'll sometimes come up on the river where, like, let's say you have a medium-ish top pair that you would normally value bet against weak, tight, straightforward players. But against players who are going to put you in tough spots, you want to be very inclined to just check it. I mean, there was a spot I'm remembering right now at Bellagio where I like value bet top pair and then got check raised on the river against a good player, and I called it off and he just like showed me the nuts. Like, bad players just almost always betting with the nuts when they have the nuts on the river, whereas good players are not going to do that. And they're going to put you in tough spots by checking with a balanced range. And sometimes they're going to have bluffs and sometimes they're not, and they're going to have roughly the balanced frequencies. And you just don't want to open yourself up to getting raised in those spots. So when you don't want to go broke with your hand, or when you don't want to face a raise with your hand, and your hand also realizes realizes equity pretty well just by checking, you just want to check. All right. Next, triple barreling for all your money. You should generally shy away from risking your entire stack because one failure will cost you all future profitable opportunities, right? So let's say you raise from the button, the big blind calls, the flop comes 8-7-2 and your opponent checks. So this is a spot where if you just like straight up go down, break up your range using the poker coaching method, you're going to find that you have a spot where you can probably bet with all your bluffs, which are going to be a lot of your draws and your made hands. And you're going to have probably a few too many bluffs, but not too many bluffs, right? You may have like 70% bluffs or something. This is fine, especially given all those draws have lots of equity. But on the turn, inevitably, a lot of those are going to miss a lot of the time, especially on a blank turn. So now you have to choose between continuing to barrel off with all of your draws, which is now going to be far too many, right? Because it's still going to be 70-ish or 70-30 premium made hands or draws to premium made hands, whereas it needs to be 50-50, right? Now you're going to need to check some of them. So there are a few things you can do to sidestep this spot, especially against generally good players, right? So what you can do to sidestep this spot is you can check behind the flop with some of your draws that have a decent amount of equity. And that may even be hands like 10-9, right? You can check back 10-9, call or raise any turn bet, and then go from there. And notice that takes that hand out of your flop betting range, which is also going to make it not in your turn betting range. And same thing goes with a hand like Jack 10, right? Or Jack 9. These are hands that you may want to bet. You know, there's nothing wrong with betting them, but realize the consequence of betting them on the flop on boards like this. Whenever it does come a blank on the turn, you're just going to have a load of bluffs, especially if you have hands like 9-6 offsuit in your range, which is obviously too wide, but, you know, could be fine to open that. Maybe stuff like 6-5, right? Notice you have the suited versions of all of those. So I'm not saying it's wrong to bet the flop, but realize that in spots like this where there are a lot of draws available, you are going to have a lot of triple barreling opportunities, and you may want to shy away from that, especially if your opponents will call the flop frequently. But once they make it past, they'll call the flop infrequently. So if your opponents are going to not defend against continuation bets often enough, when they do make it past the flop, it means they have something decent. If they have something decent, you need to be kind of careful. That said, so keeping that in mind, many players are far too weak and passive, right? So you should actually play wider pre-flop ranges when you will rarely get 3-bet because you'll frequently be able to see the flop, allowing you to realize your equity decently well. I remember watching a training video on Pokar a while back, which is a private coaching site for the Pokar backies and the advisors. And they're basically saying, like, if your opponents don't 3-bet you very often, you get to raise with something like 20-ish%, with a 20-ish% wider range. So if you normally raise with, let's say, 20% of hands, you can actually raise with like 24% of hands from that spot, which allows you to play a decently wider range, right? And that's because you just get to see the flop and you get to see the turn and you get to see the river way more often than you will against good, strong GTO players. So a lot of these GTO charts recommend, you know, pretty solid-ish strategies, right? And that's because they're presuming their opponents are going to respond in a generally solid way. But if your opponents don't respond in a generally solid way and they're just too tight and too passive, you get to play way more hands. Also, I think many players, especially in the small and medium stakes games, still fold far too often to continuation bets. So, at least in my experience, once your opponent calls your flop continuation bet, they typically have something decent. Now, that may not be the case in your games. Please, please, please recognize that may not be the case in your games. And if your opponents, let's say, call the flop every single time in your games, then you want to continue betting on the turn and the river, right? You always want to be exploiting whatever your opponents do incorrectly. And if your opponents in these scenarios will call the flop, but then call the turn a ton, but then fold on the river, well, that means you need to be triple barreling them a lot, right? So you need to figure that out. Did you get this correctly? On the turn, you want to bet with draws that have less equity / showdown value. It depends. Depends on the scenario, depends on what your whole range looks like in general. Right? If you don't have any draws, you just take whatever draws you can find. If you have a load of draws, the ones that are really bad probably just want to give up, right? Like say you have a bad gut shot. Let's go back over here on this example. Say you had 6-4, right? That's a pretty bad draw. If the turn's like a 10, it's just a pretty rough spot for you, and I don't think you want to keep betting. But like say you randomly had King 9 there, it's probably okay to keep betting. I don't know. It's an interesting question because it depends on the scenario. But once your opponent does get past the flop, if you think their range is going to be a little bit stronger, you don't want to be bluffing with your draws. They're just in really bad shape because those are basically junk hands at that point. All right, next, let's talk about ICM pressure. That really changes at least standard GTO. That said, the solvers now have ways for you to plug in payout implications for every normal-ish payout structure. So the problem is that it's difficult to definitively know what to do in these spots. And also in a tournament, like let's say you're trying to simulate a spot where there's 40 people left in the tournament. Well, it depends a lot if there are players in the tournament who have like one big blind compared to if everybody has 30 big blinds or more, right? Those are very different scenarios because when everybody has one big blind, you can actually apply some pressure to the shallow stacks, whereas when everyone has 30, you can apply way less pressure to the short stacks, right? So it's hard to definitively know what scenario you're exactly in, but there are some general principles that you can adhere to when there is clearly a substantial, or there are substantial payout implications. And that's usually going to be the case at or near the exact bubble, or at the final table, or leading up to the final table, right? Basically, when you can have a clear picture of what the stacks are in the tournament, you can then adjust accordingly. So let's just talk about as the big stack, as the medium stack, and as the shallow stack in general. As the big stack, you want to apply pressure. I just did a little coffee episode this morning on chipping up, like how do you chip up in tournaments? And someone asked, once you double up, should we just start being tight now? And the answer is absolutely not. If anything, you want to continue applying pressure, even more so than before. Because now you're not at risk of going broke, right? You just get to apply pressure to your opponents and put them in bad spots where they are at risk of going broke. And that's clearly a good spot to be in, right? So, as the big stack, you want to be applying pressure, especially when there are payout implications, which implies calling or 3-betting a lot pre-flop, especially from imposition and the big blind against the middle stacks, and sometimes the short stacks if you think they're opening a little bit too wide. So you want to be attacking spots where your opponent's range should be weak. A good example of this is a situation that came from excelling at tough no limit hold'em games, my new book that'll be out at the World Series, from, I think it was Vlada, who has a chapter on ICM and adjustments. There was a spot where someone raised, we call big blind with a wide range as the big stack at the final table with obvious payout implications. On the low card boards like 7-5-4, the big stack actually gets to lead the flop, bet the turn, and jam the river into like 30-ish to 40-ish big blind medium stacks a ton. And you do that with all your bluffs, or a lot of your bluffs, and some of your nut hands. And the reason for that is because you get to apply immense ICM pressure to the middle stack because they really don't want to go broke before the shallow stacks that are hanging around. And this is a spot where normally leading's at least viable, but it's certainly not great. But the spots that are like perhaps normally viable, like normally aggressive lines you could consider, but often just don't take because they're not great, like leading in general on the flop, those scenarios become way more of a consideration as your opponents have to be more aware of the payout implications. So definitely consider spots like that. This is something I actually don't have a ton of experience in, spots where I've been playing these spots wrong. And, to be fair, probably everyone plays these spots wrong. And you want to be looking for scenarios like this where you can apply pressure as the big stack to the middle stacks. And as the middle stack, you want to shy away from spots like this, right? So how do you do that? Well, as a middle stack, your goal is to outlast the short stack. So realize that the big stacks should be applying pressure to you. That's what they're supposed to do, right? So if you know that they will apply pressure because they're good, competent big stacks, tighten up your pre-flop ranges so that you can defend better against their aggression. we're going to finish reviewing that tournament that Michael Acevedo started reviewing with me last week. We're going to be doing that on Thursday for all of you, for Poker Coaching members. And I know good and well at the final table, he may say that I was being a little bit too tight with the middle stack. It was a very odd payout structure where it was a $1,000 tournament, but third place was $6,000, second was $9,000, and first was like $12,000. So very, very weird structure where getting in the money was just incredibly relevant, incredibly important. So I was the middle stack in that scenario on the bubble, and I just played really tight. And I was getting third place unless something horrible happened. And inevitably we did get, did I take third or second? I don't know what I took. I think I took third in that one. But it was a spot where like my whole goal was to just get in the money because getting in the money was highly valuable there. Now, if getting in the money was 1.5 buy-ins like in a regular tournament, I would have been way less inclined, especially if the payouts were like 1.5 buy-ins for third and then 4 buy-ins for second and 15 buy-ins for third or something absurd like that. Then we're just playing to win, right? So you need to be very keenly aware of the payout structure. And I would definitely suggest all of you, if you're not going to be able to watch that webinar live with Michael, go back and watch it. It'll be on pokercoaching.com somewhere. So make sure you go back and watch that because I know I'm learning a ton and I'm sure that you all can learn a ton as well. So you want to be tightening up when you expect to face aggression. However, you may not necessarily always face aggression from your particular opponent. There are plenty of big stacks out there who play way, way, way too tightly. They think that their goal is to slowly chip up and just like not play any big pots without, like they're just going to take the very obvious spots, I guess. And they don't view it as an obvious spot when the middle stack opens. They think the middle stack opened, okay, now I need to be tight because I want to make sure that I don't double up the middle stack because that's like the only bad thing that can really happen, right? So some of these big stacks will shy away from attacking the middle stack, which basically allows you to open raise as if you are the big stack. And if you can play the middle stack as if you're the big stack, well, you're just going to win way more tournaments, right? Because you get to play way more than your fair share of hands. So definitely look for spots like that where the big stack is just kind of hanging out. I mean, it goes back to that question that was asked this morning on my episode of A Little Coffee, where like once you've doubled up, once you're the big stack, should you just hang out? And some people think the answer to that's yes, but the answer to that's absolutely not. But if your opponents will just hang out and not battle hard, then you get to act like the big stack. So you're going to have to make big adjustments in these scenarios based on what your opponents do incorrectly. So as a short stack, you may have multiple goals, or you're going to have one of two goals at least. Usually it's to outlast the other shallow stacks if there are immediate payout implications. That's going to be on like exactly the bubble or near the bubble. That's going to be at the final table where 2 or 3 players have clear short stacks. But if there are not other clear short stacks, or if there are no immediate payout implications, like let's say you're in a spot where 12th, 11th, and 10th place all get the same amount of money, and there are 3 shallow stacks, and you're one of them, well, you're probably going to take 12th, 11th, or 10th unless something happens, right? So in that scenario, your goal needs to be to try to get a hold of chips. Give yourself a reasonable chance to double up. And the best spot to do this is when you still have some fold equity, right? So if someone raises from late position, usually a big stack, right? Or a middle stack once the big stacks have folded, or the middle stack if the big stack's being tight. In those scenarios, you want to raise or jam over the top of them with a much wider range than you may normally use. Good example, let's say big stack in the cutoff raises and you're in this on the button or small blind or big blind with 9-7 suited, right? It's a spot where you probably don't really love calling unless you're exactly in the big blind. And you probably want to be jamming it all in if you have something like 12 to 25 big blinds. And I mean, yes, you're risking going broke, but that's going to be a very profitable jam if your opponent is generally opening just a little bit too wide. And the big stack usually is, or should be, opening a little bit too wide. And that's going to allow you to chip up. And it may even result in the big stack slowing down and not raising as often, which is going to give you more potential open raising spots. So that's a good spot to look to use your short stack to the best of your ability. Another one is you should be defending the big blind reasonably wide and then just looking to check raise all in with any pair or draw. Assuming, again, you have some fold equity, right? And if you don't have fold equity, you're usually just getting very good pot odds to the point that if you get any pair or draw, you're fine enough getting it in. So you really just have to play some pots when you get shallow because you're going to be the next one out, most likely. Or if, you know, some setup happens, you move up one payout spot, which is fine and nice, but it's not like you're going to get rich off of that, right? So this is a situation where you have to be a little bit inclined to battle. And a lot of people aren't. A lot of people get in their minds they're supposed to just be really tight and try to move up the payout spots at all costs. And they blind down from 10 big blinds to 2. And inevitably, all the opponents are also competent, right? They're just sitting there playing decently. So realize that. So if your opponents are not going to give away their stacks, which usually in these scenarios, most opponents as medium stacks are not just going to give away their stack, right? They're going to sit there and wait for you to blind out. If they're going to wait for you to blind out, then you can't just sit there and be a net. Okay?